Do you ever do any editing afterwards? Like if I like start coughing or I say like, hey, I need like a minute to reflect.
I mostly try not to because I don't want to ever like feel like I'm changing anybody's thought. But like if you start coughing or if the phone rings or I don't know, a monkey jumps in the room, we could definitely edit that out. No problem at all. Hi, everybody. Todd Conklin, Pre-Accident Podcast. How are you today? I'll be your host. And if I haven't said it in a while, I need to. If you've just joined the podcast, welcome. I'm glad you're here. You're about to go on a big ride. Ask your friends. If you've listened for years, then, God, you're amazing. Because even I lose interest after a while, and I have to do these. I mean, it's part of what I do. No, I'm glad you're here. I shouldn't make fun of it. It's great. Today's podcast is... You're going to like this podcast. This is an interesting podcast for a bunch of reasons. Now, I'm not in my normal place doing my normal stuff, so I'll put this together really quickly. We're going to talk to a guy named Campbell Macdonald, who's from a company called Proxy in Vancouver, Canada. That's Canada, not Canada, Texas. Canada, Canada. And Campbell is, you're going to like this conversation because we're not going to talk much about marketing stuff. We're going to talk a lot about data and prediction and linearity and truth and all the things that I think are really interesting to talk about. And that makes this podcast completely worthwhile. Proxy makes a detector, a wearable detector that you can determine if you're close to high voltage. And so it's a cool idea. I think of it kind of like a rumble strip. And this is what I was telling Campbell. Is I don't think it's a prevention tool. I think it's a control. And if it buzzes, that means you're close to the action and you need to be careful. Get back. Step back, baby. Step back, Jack. Get back. That is kind of where this podcast goes. You'll see as we progress through. I think Campbell... I think I fried his mind a little, and he fried mine. It was a mind-frying podcast. So let me get into it, and then we can talk afterwards, because I think there's some stuff we should talk about afterwards. But for now, thanks for listening to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. I hope you're having a great summer. I don't even have any reports. So busy. The class was amazing. We had such a good time in Denver. Thank you for coming. It was really, really fun. But now, let's jump into the podcast. This, my friends, is Campbell Macdonald.
And my view now is that like all history is revisionist. Like unless you were there, it's all revisionist. So
yes, it's like the notion of facts. Facts exist based upon context, right? I mean, facts are negotiable.
I mean, when I was in school, I studied like history of thought and history of science, and I actually do think that there are some facts that are out there or certain realities. Yeah, like things like some math facts. Like I think the idea of prime numbers are something that we can agree on. There's certain things that are like realities that are, I think are, touchstones or basis for having logical discussions that are somewhat immutable. But things, that involve observation, subjective evaluations, and that includes like a lot of stuff like science, like biology, is definitely like the term facts is a tricky term.
Interesting. So you see truth in math. Very interesting.
Yeah. I'm a math nerd.
Yes, you clearly, if you're not an engineer, you should be. You're missing a chance there.
Well, I've done a lot of math. I did economics in school, and economics is clearly not facts, but you do a lot of math and you learn math there. And that's actually changed my view of safety and just safety analysis. Like that's actually when I got into looking at safety and how they use data, for example, I was initially thinking, okay, there's going to be this accepted view on safety and this accepted view on data. And I've been kind of, I don't want to say depressed, but a little bit shocked at the types of data that are kind of seen as touchstones or bedrock for safety discussions, when in fact they're really terrible data sets, either very, very small samples of infrequent events, highly subjective analysis, or outright biased data. And that's true of many analyses, but the fact that there isn't some acknowledgement up front is pretty surprising to me.
Why do you think that exists in the safety? What's your gut tell you?
So I actually had thought about this a bit. I actually did a talk last week on this. I was at a safety conference in Montreal, and my thesis is that predictive analysis has got kind of a dirty, like this is a bigger topic, but predictive analysis has a dirty or a bit of a bad reputation in safety circles because of Heinrich's triangle. He came up and said, hey, we've got this relationship between minor injuries and major injuries, and it's this fixed ratio. And that's been thoroughly debunked. And so for a lot of people, like what that's said is like, well, we can't really trust these leading indicators or data, so let's use process, policies, checklists, and what have you to stay safe. And I don't want to say that that's bad, because that would be throwing, the baby out with the bathwater. There have been real safety gains, particularly with minor injuries, because of these processes and checklists. I can say with a fairly high degree of certainty, and based on my own experience managing safety teams, that best practices process and checklists to ensure that tasks have been completed in general have been a good thing. The trouble with that is that they've been elevated to a status of not really being questioned, and there's also a limit to their effectiveness. So that's a huge kind of thesis, but let me just unpack it quickly. So on the one hand, you've seen real gains from these checklists and processes. The trouble is that it's gotten to the point where every time that there's an accident or an injury, there has to be a new process. And I think that there's a cognitive limit or a maximum cognitive load that people can handle in terms of processes. And so if you combine that with the fact that there's human error, you have to start prioritizing which processes matter to which workers. So that's one side. The other side is that checklists themselves, while they're effective and good because, again, there's a maximum cognitive load that people can handle, a checklist provides a cue for you to look at things. But it's also not a perfect data set. I've managed many teams where they've pencil whipped checklists. And so you've got a complete checklist. You've done that safety check, but the data is terrible because they haven't even inspected it. They've just gone down and pencil whipped the checklist. So you've got this data set that's complete, but yet completely biased. And so when you start looking at this in general, you see that, oh, okay, we've got this holy body of process and checklist that's seen as immutable, but has real limits. And yet you have this data set that's inherently biased and subjective and somewhat a small sample that is, and you're kind of now painted yourself in this corner of like, where do you go next? You're almost at in statistics, what you'd call like a local maxima. You can't really move off of it because you've got these beliefs, and yet you've got nowhere to turn to get to a better outcome with like fewer incidences or better outcomes, however you define that.
So what do we do with that? I mean, that's a really interesting group of ideas you just presented. What's it mean?
Sorry, what do we do with it now?
Yeah, what's that mean? What's that mean for taking all the things you just said, which were quite remarkable, and what does that mean for sort of a person managing safety forward from this point on?
So first of all, I don't know. I've got some ideas.
That's a great answer, by the way. That's a perfect answer. So that's good. Tell me your ideas.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm super biased. So I'm in the electrical safety space, and I build and sell electrical sensors. So I'm mostly focused on working with organizations, industrial organizations that are focused on reducing the number of serious incidences, specifically electrical incidences. And so if you take a step back, like kind of going back to Heinrich's triangle, the reason why it got torn apart is they realized that if you're like trying to avoid cuts and sprained ankles, you can do that, but that's unlikely to have much, if any, effect on fatalities and catastrophes. And so that's a good realization. The other realization they found is that most serious injuries and fatalities tend to fall into a relatively narrow scope incidences. And there's things like being confined in a space, being pinned, gas asphyxiation, falls. But I think 3 or 4 of the kind of the big 10 are related to electrical. So like hot permit works, high voltage, and there's one other related to electrical contact. So I'm obviously very focused in that space. And so when I look at this, I say like, oh, okay, well, I'm biased here because this is a space that I work in. But I'm saying, is there not a better data set to help organizations identify high-risk workers, high-risk teams, and high-risk locations? And can we not move away from this occasional workplace inspection framework to something where we're constantly looking at what everyone's doing all the time and getting a really robust data set, maybe even moving away from a sample to a population, and not just looking at occasional inspection, but real-time notification of activities, and rolling that data up so that we can do robust analyses over time, like days, months, years, and really dig into the data. So that's my bias. And again, like I'm a data nerd, so like I'm always looking for more data. So that's one side. The other side is also just saying, what are the, like, maybe even just doing like an audit from the point of view of what are all the processes that we have for workers, and which ones do we think actually really matter? Like, are we downloading requirements onto workers that aren't really relevant to that role? And that's always a hard thing to do, because you're always thinking in the back of your mind as a manager, what if I take something away that could have saved one life? And that's a hard thing to do. But I think the other side is, if you think that if any one person can only hold 5, 6, 7 things in their mind at once, and you've got 100 processes, like, unless you've got some serious muscle memory to drill this into people, you're kind of deluding yourself if you think that all these processes are being held in memory at one time. And so I don't know how you get away from that, but I think there's a side of saying we can do more with automation, because we're offloading that cognitive load from the worker, and we can start pruning some unnecessary processes to free up mental space so that they can actually be alert and aware and focused on their job and their environment and react to emerging situations.
That's amazing. And introduce yourself, Campbell. I think it's a good time to sort of tell people who you are.
Yeah, so my name is Campbell Macdonald. I'm the CEO of Proxy, and we build an electrical wristband and solution for industrial workers to keep them safe around electricity. So we came into this space because we had hydroelectric utilities who were looking for a wearable sensor. Specifically, BC Hydro had identified a need for a wearable sensor. And when we started looking at this, we thought, okay, well, surely this must exist already. And obviously there are induction sensors out there, but there's nothing that's worn by workers all day, every day at the moment. There's tick tracers that you can buy at Home Depot to sense to see if a panel is live. And there are some industrial solutions, but they're kind of bulky. But the thing that's really crazy is that none of them are connected. None of them are gathering data on worker behavior to say, like, hey, Campbell's had a warn, or Campbell's had a near miss, or Campbell's actually wearing the device from a compliance point of view. So it's really surprising, because in my past lives, I've always been building software solutions, and it's kind of a given that anything you do is going to generate data that's going to go to a dashboard for someone to dig in deeper. You're never going to have someone doing something that can be instrumented and not have that measured in some way, whether it's anonymized or personalized or rolled up to a team. It seems crazy in this day and age, when you have the ability to do digital analysis, that you wouldn't at least consider the possibility that there may be some value add there.
But isn't the fear that the data you're collecting could be weaponized and used against the worker? I mean, that's the $1 million question. So let's just ask it early.
Yeah, no. I mean, so like I've got many strong opinions, and I've got super strong opinions on this. So let's go a step further, and then we'll come back to safety. So I believe that some of the richest data out there is biometric data. I think there's a huge data store out there in terms of looking at worker movement, heart rate, fatigue measurement, hydration, and data points that I can't even envision. I meet in my world, I meet all kinds of incredible wearable companies that are gathering data that's incredibly personal. The resistance to that in the workplace, both from liability to employers and from employee reaction to, as you say, super invasive data, is real. So there have to be some limits around that. Now, the data set that we're gathering, which is looking at worker movement around highly energized devices and whether or not they're wearing a safety wearable, is way less personal. But you're right. We could definitely set our product up to track workers all the time and every time. And we've specifically set up fences so that we're not sharing that data. We're only sharing interaction around highly energized devices. So while there's definitely like a big brother component to that, where your workers are saying, well, hey, why are you doing this? And we're saying, listen, this is something that we think is going to be valuable to you, and it's also because it's going to protect you and increase the likelihood that you're going to go home at the end of the day. And we can also protect your coworkers with this because we're going to have data to help understand whether there are teams that we're putting at risk unnecessarily. So there's definitely like a risk trade-off, but we also have to be engaged with organizations to say, hey, we're going to use this data responsibly. We're not going to use this data as a productivity measure, which is for most workers what they're afraid of. It's the Dunkin' Donut problem. Like, hey, are you going to track me when I go for a coffee break and I stay on for 20 minutes instead of 15? And that's just where you have to put limits around the data to say that you're not going to measure that.
You translated that into the United States model. Instead of saying Tim Hortons, you said Dunkin' Donuts.
I have both of them. I don't actually have the European example, but it probably involves something like a croissant or biscuit or something like that. But yeah, I have both stories.
you can speak with but I think the string on this one's worth pulling more because so I agree with you. I think there's a real bias towards prevention, and that to me what manages at least catastrophic failure is the absence or presence of controls. And I see your wearable or wearables like this as indicators, as really prevention tools, but really what they are control tools. I'm close to the risk. It's alerting me that I'm close to the risk, and I learned something I didn't know. It can make a surprise condition less surprising. The idea that the employer, I see this all the time with in-vehicle monitoring. We monitor this information, but we won't use it against the worker until they screw up, and then we absolutely use in-vehicle monitoring against the worker. That sort of draws me to this question: why track near misses? I mean, what do we learn from that, other than that the worker was alerted they were close to the hazard and successfully moved away?
So you're asking actually two questions there. So one is we have the ability as a product company to limit the information we're sharing with companies. Now we can have companies say, well, hey, we want this information, or in the case of a criminal matter, police could come in and say, hey, we want this data, and then we as a company have to determine, if we're going to share that. But right now, we're saying to companies and to workers, we're not tracking individuals around. Except for incidences where you're interacting with highly energized devices. So if you're in a coffee shop or in an office space, we're not getting any data. We just know you're wearing the device, and that's all we're tracking. And so it's a very simple, is it being used or not? So that's one piece. And we as a product company have just made that decision because we think that these questions or the risk to safety by opening up data to punish workers is too great. Like, we want to be viewed strictly as a safety company, not as a productivity company. The second thing you asked, which is, how do we, why do near misses matter? So we're taking this from the point of view of two things. One is we're going to warn workers just so there's an awareness piece. And why do we track it? We track it because right now, workers are governed by limits of approach. The electrical safety standard is covered by NFPA 70E, which has this table which says, at a certain voltage level, depending on your qualification, you have to stay, 2 feet, 3 feet, 10 feet away from this device. And we're simply emulating that, and we're using that as a data point to say, hey, are your workers getting inside here? Is this something that we need to understand at a more robust level? So the thing I would say is, we actually track two stages. We track a warning, which is actually outside the limits of approach, and a near miss, which is inside the limits of approach. And I think the question is, why do you track warnings? And the reason we track warnings is simply to have it as a touchstone to see, for us to see, and for our customers to see, is there a relationship between warnings and near misses? My hypothesis is no. Like a warning is not a breach in any way. It's just simply to show that the device is operating and that workers are aware of it, and we have a data point that we can look at for future analysis. A near miss at this point is really a trigger for an investigation. And so we think that that's a valuable touchstone at the moment. Whether that evolves over time, we'll see. But right now, it's a way to identify when workers are getting inside there, and for organizations to really have a much more robust data set. So I don't know if you realize this, but right now, if you have a breach of a limit of approach, that's considered a near miss and should trigger an investigation. Now, at the same time, most of our customers believe that 90 to 98% of near misses go unreported, either unintentionally because the worker or team hasn't even realized that they've had a near miss, or it's intentional. There's the worker, because of fear of workplace repercussion, professional pride, just doesn't report it because they don't want to be viewed as an incompetent or high-risk worker.
Well, I mean, there's so much there. So first of all reporting is voluntary. Even mandatory reporting is voluntary, right? So that goes to the culture and trust that's built in the organization. So I got you there. I guess the question I would ask, because it's really curious to me, is a near miss a near miss, or with this wearable, is a near miss actually an event where the wearable functioned? So it's not a near miss. It's an event where the control worked, and because the control worked, we didn't have a negative outcome. I see that kind of in my mind, and I could be wrong on this, Campbell, but in my mind, that's different than a near miss. That's an event where the wearable made its money.
So we're using the language of the safety space. So that's a great point, and we wrestle with this. Is a warning a warning? Is it an alert? Is a near miss a warning? Or
is it a success? I mean, the word I would use aggressively with you isn't that why you have the wearable on? I mean, that's a success.
And that's a great point. And that's something that I have not heard that, but that's actually, I think I might steal that if you don't mind.
Oh,
because
please. And the reason I push you on it is because the idea of a near miss, I think, really swings me back in kind of a normative way to behavior. Had he been more careful, he would not have had this near miss. I would actually suggest the reason the wearable's there is as a control. When I get close to a hazard, in this case an electrical hazard, it tells me I'm close and I move my hand back. That's not a near miss. That's absolutely that's why we bought the equipment. I mean, that's a success. And I would suggest that that's a party. It's not an opportunity for an investigation, although I know why you use the word investigation. It's really an opportunity to learn. And I think that learning opportunity is really valuable. To me, if this becomes a way to sort of hold workers accountable, it's not very interesting. But if it becomes a way for workers to know when they're near a surprise condition, it's brilliant.
So you've touched on a ton of things there, and most of which I agree with. So first of all, just quickly before I forget all the points, investigation is absolutely an opportunity to learn. It's a negative term, but it's definitely a learning experience. There shouldn't be blame, and so I agree with you completely. And in terms of the worker, in terms of thinking about it being protection, yes, we are trying to move away from PPE to administrative control and awareness or engineered outcomes to really keep workers safe. We want to keep them away from the hazard. So yes, we are definitely playing in that side. But as for I guess the thing that we don't have enough data and enough experience with our product to really say that this is, yes, we're trying to keep workers safe, but we are not part of the critical path of keeping workers safe. Like, we're not suggesting that this should be a diagnostic tool or be eliminating any of the existing safety steps right now in terms of things like lockout, tagout, or contact sensors to verify de-energization. So that's just where I want to draw that distinction.
And I appreciate that, and I definitely see where you're going with that. One of the things I would say is that what it really is another layer.
Yes.
So it makes a lockout tagout better. It makes procedural adherence better. It's an additional layer of control. And I would invite you to just play around with the idea of kind of letting go of the hierarchy of controls and and see controls as either hard controls or soft controls. And then you want to ask the question, is a wearable that buzzes when I get close to, or alerts me when I get close to high voltage, is that a hard control or a soft control? The notion of hierarchy of control is really, really seductive because it's linear and it sort of gives the world order, kind of like what we started with, math, right? It makes everything very seductively predictive. The problem with the hierarchy of control is that there are times where PPE is in fact the best control. It's just the best control. And so that kind of blows that hierarchy notion out of the water. And what I think is exciting about what you're doing, and it is kind of exciting, is two things. One is you're really smart people who are thinking about this problem way differently than the rest of the industry does. Most of the rest of the industry just says, be careful, and you're not saying that. And secondly, you're really, really interested in how we can take this and use this information that we can gather to actually become smarter, better, faster, and safer. That's pretty cool, dude.
Totally. And I mean, like, so first of all, thank you. That's great validation. But yeah, we are totally, we want this to be another like layer. We talk about the safety onion, and this is just another layer on it. We are definitely thinking differently than the approaches to date, but we're not alone. This definitely resonates with our customers. They're seeing this and saying, this is fantastic. Thank you for this. Not everyone agrees, so it's definitely controversial. But I think the thing that's most exciting, and then again, this is going back to the data side. And when I talk about math, I'm not talking about statistics being truth. I'm talking about, math theory. But I think the thing that's exciting about really rich unexplored data sets is the stuff that you're going to learn over time that you didn't even think about, when you started. So this is, right now it's day one for us. But the feedback that we're getting already in terms of how this can be used from an organization learning to just ask, and this is the way we frame it with customers, is that we don't have the answers for safety. This Proxy doesn't provide this. It's not a solution to solve everything, but it is a basis to ask way better questions than you're asking right now of your safety organization.
So how do people get a hold of you? Because I know people are going to want to talk more to you. How do they get a hold of you?
It's just through our website is the easiest way. Proxy, proxxi.co. And there's a contact form, or you can email me directly, Campbell at ProxyCode. So CAMPBELL at PROXXI.co. So anytime.
Okay, Piancis, what'd you think, huh? Interesting. The whole idea of prevention bias versus control bias versus prevention, that becomes really kind of a foundational part of the discussion around this kind of safeguard. And this technology, for bad or for good, and we should talk about this, whether it's bad or good, this kind of the Internet of Things and the fact that everything's kind of open to data collection. If you use Google, if you're on your cell phone, you're already sort of a big data collection tool anyway. It's how we use this data that becomes a really interesting discussion. And it's kind of almost an ethical, moral discussion. Should we weaponize data against workers? No. But what if we have a bad worker and then we have this data we can use in a weaponized? There's not a clear answer here, and you can oversimplify. I mean, I'm always quick to do that, but ultimately, this is a dilemma that will become more and more a part of our discussion as more and more things keep track of us. It's really not much different than video cameras. The whole thing's really interesting. But if you see it as an opportunity to make detection and then correction more effective, the safeguard notion of this valuable tool becomes pretty valuable. And that's kind of where I am in this discussion. I hope you liked this one. I did. Keep listening, man. It's so much fun to have you hang out with me. I enjoy it immensely. I mean it. The summer is going to fly by, so do something fun. Learn something new every single day. Will you have as much fun as you possibly can? And for goodness sakes, be safe.